I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray my life. I simply realized I had never truly chosen it. That thought came to me in a moment so ordinary it almost felt insulting. I was standing still, waiting for something trivial, a screen to load, a message to arrive, time to pass, when it hit me with unsettling clarity. I had been waiting my entire life. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting to feel confident. Waiting to feel like the person living my life was actually me. Nothing about my situation looked wrong. If anything, it looked correct. Logical. Justified. My choices lined up neatly when explained to other people. Each step followed the previous one without obvious error. That's what made it so hard to admit. I had done everything right and still felt absent. For years, I told myself that discomfort was temporary. That once I reached the next milestone, things would click into place. I treated my life like a project that just needed more time, more patience, more effort before it felt complete. So I endured. Endurance became my defining trait. I learned how to adapt quickly. How to suppress hesitation. How to move forward without asking unnecessary questions. I became someone who could carry weight without complaining, who could accept responsibility without resistance. People admired that. They said I was grounded, mature, strong. They didn't know how often I felt like I was impersonating myself. I remember moments that should have felt important achievements, transitions, turning points, landing with a dull thud instead of meaning. I smiled. I nodded. I moved on. Inside, there was nothing to hold onto. I told myself that was adulthood. But adulthood wasn't supposed to feel like disappearance. The first cracks appeared in how I related to time. Days moved quickly but left no memory. Weeks passed without emotional markers. I could describe what I did, but not how it felt. My life became a sequence of events I witnessed rather than lived. I didn't feel sad. I felt detached. And detachment is dangerous because it feels functional. I started to notice how many of my decisions were shaped by other people's expectations, not because they pressured me, but because I anticipated what would be easiest to explain. What would cause the least disruption? What would keep everything moving smoothly? I wasn't being controlled. I was self-regulating into silence. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself what I wanted. The question felt childish, irresponsible, unrealistic. Wanting things complicated plans. Wanting things created risk. So I learned how not to want. That skill cost me more than I realized. I began to feel like my life was happening at a safe distance. Close enough to manage, far enough not to hurt. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't fulfilled. I existed in a neutral space where nothing demanded my full presence. That neutrality slowly hollowed me out. One evening, alone, I tried to remember the last decision I had made purely because it felt true, not reasonable, not strategic, not defensible, just true. I couldn't find one. That frightened me. Because it meant my life had been built on compliance, not choice. On momentum, not direction. On being agreeable instead of being honest. I realized then that the life I was living belonged to a version of me that no longer existed, if it ever truly had. I had grown into someone else quietly, without ceremony, without permission. And the worst part, no one had noticed. I was still performing well enough to avoid suspicion. Still meeting expectations. Still functioning. The absence I felt was invisible even to the people closest to me. That invisibility made it easier to stay. And harder to leave. I felt guilt for questioning a life that wasn't broken. Shame for wanting more when I had so much. Fear that changing course now would mean admitting I had wasted years following the wrong direction. I wasn't sure I could survive that admission. So I stayed silent. Until silence became unbearable. The thought that finally broke through my defenses was simple and devastating: if I keep living this life, I will never know who I could have been. Not because I failed, but because I never tried. That thought didn't push me into action immediately. It haunted me instead. Because once you realize you're living someone else's life, even if that someone else is your past self, you can't unknow it. And every day you stay becomes a choice. Once I admitted to myself that I was living someone else's life, I didn't suddenly become brave. I became afraid. Not of change, of acknowledgement. Because acknowledgement meant responsibility. It meant admitting that the distance I felt wasn't an accident or a phase, but the result of years of small, deliberate compromises. It meant facing the fact that I had agreed to a life that no longer recognized me. I tried to negotiate with that realization. I told myself it was too late to change direction. That I had already invested too much time, effort, identity. That disrupting everything now would only prove how misguided I had been all along. That argument sounded mature. It was also a trap. I started paying closer attention to my thoughts, and I noticed how often they revolved around justification. Justifying staying. Justifying silence. Justifying why now wasn't the right moment to ask hard questions. I had an explanation for everything. Explanations are powerful. They allow you to remain still while convincing yourself you're being thoughtful. But explanations don't stop time. The more I watched myself explain my way out of action, the more trapped I felt. Every day looked similar to the last, not because nothing changed, but because I did. I moved through my routines with increasing distance, like a caretaker maintaining a museum of past decisions. I began to feel resentment not toward anyone else, but toward my own compliance. Resentment for the version of me who had chosen safety over curiosity. Resentment for the ease with which I had silenced doubt. Resentment for how long I had called that silence peace. That resentment frightened me. It felt dangerous to admit anger when nothing obvious was wrong. I worried it meant I was ungrateful, unstable, selfish. I worried it meant something in me was broken. So I suppressed it. And suppression has consequences. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I became restless. Sleep lost its depth. My chest felt tight in moments that should have been neutral. I found myself distracted, irritable, emotionally blunt. I wasn't burning out. I was disconnecting further. I tried to imagine what would happen if I stayed. Not dramatically, just realistically. The same environment. The same expectations. The same version of me extended forward indefinitely. The image felt unbearable. Not because it was painful. Because it was empty. I realized then that the life I was living didn't require my full presence anymore. It ran on habits, obligations, and inertia. It would continue functioning even if I checked out completely. And I was already halfway gone. That realization shifted something. For the first time, staying felt active rather than passive. It felt like a choice, one I would have to own. And once staying became a choice, it lost its illusion of safety. I started to understand that I wasn't afraid of failing at something new. I was afraid of admitting that I had succeeded at the wrong thing. That admission felt devastating. Because it meant mourning years I couldn't get back. It meant accepting that good intentions don't guarantee alignment. It meant forgiving myself for choices that were reasonable but not true. Forgiveness felt impossible then. I carried guilt like a second spine. Guilt for wanting change. Guilt for imagining alternatives. Guilt for the disruption my honesty might cause. I had built my identity around being dependable. Being the one who didn't need much. The one who adjusted instead of resisted. Leaving that identity felt like betrayal. But staying inside it felt like erasure. I reached a point where I understood something with painful clarity: no one was coming to interrupt my life for me. There would be no external crisis dramatic enough to justify leaving. No collapse I could point to and say, see, I had no choice. If I waited for that, I might wait forever. and I would disappear quietly, with no one to blame. That was the moment the balance tipped. The fear of changing was still there, sharp and persistent. But another fear had grown larger, the fear of never knowing myself beyond the roles I had accepted. I didn't want to die with unanswered questions. Not questions about success or recognition, but about authorship. About whether I had ever truly chosen anything at all. I realized then that my life didn't feel wrong because it was bad. It felt wrong because it wasn't mine anymore. And ownership can't be reclaimed without cost. I wasn't ready yet to pay that cost. But I knew I would have to. Because once you see that you're living someone else's life, even if that someone else is a younger, more cautious version of yourself, staying becomes a risk. Not a moral risk. An existential one. And I was running out of ways to pretend otherwise. The moment I stopped living someone else's life didn't come with certainty. It came with exhaustion. Not the kind you fix with sleep, but the kind that settles into your bones after years of pretending that staying still is the same as being loyal. I reached a point where maintaining the life I had agreed to required more energy than leaving it. And that's when fear changed shape. For a long time, fear had been the reason I stayed. Fear of regret. Fear of disruption. Fear of admitting I had chosen wrong. But now fear was doing something else. It was warning me. Warning me that if I stayed, I wouldn't just lose time, I would lose myself permanently. That the distance I felt wasn't going to close on its own. That silence, once learned, becomes a habit. I didn't wake up one day ready. I woke up unable to continue pretending I was. That distinction matters. Because readiness implies confidence, and confidence never came. What came instead was clarity, not about what I wanted, but about what I could no longer tolerate. I could no longer tolerate waking up without intention. I could no longer tolerate explaining my life instead of inhabiting it. I could no longer tolerate calling absence stability. So I made a decision without waiting to feel brave. I chose disruption over erasure. The first step wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce anything. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't reinvent myself overnight. I simply stopped reinforcing a version of my life that required my silence. I stopped saying yes automatically. I stopped planning years ahead in directions that felt hollow. I stopped managing other people's expectations before acknowledging my own. That alone changed everything. The structure I had built began to loosen, not because I attacked it, but because I withdrew my compliance. And without constant reinforcement, it couldn't hold the same shape. Some things fell away quietly. Routines that no longer made sense. Relationships built on convenience rather than connection. An image of myself that depended on being endlessly agreeable. Losing those things hurt. But the pain felt honest. It didn't numb me. It didn't hollow me out. It arrived, demanded to be felt, and passed. That was new. For the first time in years, my emotions had movement. I began to make choices without asking whether they would look reasonable in hindsight. I chose based on something far less impressive and far more reliable. Presence. If a choice required me to disappear emotionally, I didn't make it. If it demanded performance over truth, I paused. If it pulled me into my body instead of away from it, I paid attention. This didn't make my life easier. It made it heavier. Time slowed because I was finally inside it. Days had texture again. Moments left impressions. Even mistakes felt different, less like proof of failure and more like evidence of authorship. I stopped fantasizing about who I could have been if I had chosen differently earlier. That fantasy only leads backward. Instead, I asked a quieter, harder question: who am I choosing to be now that I know the cost of not choosing? The answer wasn't fixed. It changed. Some days it scared me. Some days it disappointed me. Some days it surprised me. But it was mine. I learned something essential during that period: You don't reclaim your life by finding the right path. You reclaim it by accepting responsibility for the fact that there is no path without cost. Every version of a life excludes others. Every choice closes doors. The difference is whether you close them consciously or let time close them for you. I had let time decide for too long. That was the real regret. Not the wrong choices but the absence of choice. I stopped waiting for forgiveness from myself or anyone else. Forgiveness implies guilt, and guilt kept me tied to the past. What I needed wasn't forgiveness. It was ownership. Ownership of my time. Ownership of my direction. Ownership of the life I was still capable of living. I didn't recover what I lost. I accepted it. And acceptance did something unexpected. It freed me. Not into happiness. Not into certainty. Into participation. I began to feel like a person again, not a role, not a continuation, not a caretaker of previous decisions. A person with limits, desires, resistance, and agency. I wasn't special. I was present. And presence, I learned, is the rarest thing in a life that looks correct from the outside. If there is a final confession in the story, it's this: I didn't realize too late that I was living someone else's life. I realized it late enough to stop. Late enough to feel the weight of what I lost and early enough to refuse losing more. I don't know how the rest of my life will unfold. But I know this: I am no longer living on behalf of who I used to be. I am no longer preserving a life that doesn't need me. I am no longer waiting for permission to exist inside my own days. I am here now. Choosing imperfectly. Living consciously. And finally unmistakably living my own life.